Thank you all. Thanks for being here. I gather you have to skip your fancier lunch and eat out of a box in order to be. This is better? Okay, good. I'm glad. Okay. Ooh, I get something too. Great. Okay, I'd like to start this with something that may or may not surprise you. Often it does surprise people a great deal, which is that in 2002, a survey of college-bound high school students were asked the name of the body of water between the United States and China. 25% of them could not name it. And so if you think about that and you realize that they had no idea that it was the Pacific Ocean, nobody asked them about the Taiwan Strait, but I assume that the response would have been a whole lot worse for that. And I think that is both shocking and demoralizing and a bit frightening because the Taiwan Strait is the only place in the world where two great nuclear-armed powers could go to war. You may remember you may remember that in 1996, when missiles rained down into the waters off Taiwan, Bill Clinton sent two aircraft carrier battle groups to monitor the situation and make sure that it didn't spin out of control. Today, as I'm sure some of you know, the threat and the challenge has lessened, but war could still come through miscalculation, misunderstanding, accident, as well as intent. Straight Talk insists that readers re-examine their assumptions about security, sovereignty, and peace in the Taiwan area. And it points to the long history of mistrust in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, calling attention to the damage mistrust has caused and the jeopardy in which it has put both sides. A mistrust that remains largely unacknowledged because it is awkward and embarrassing between erstwhile allies and friends. This book, based on sources from the U.S., Taiwan, and China, including newly declassified documents, private repositories, memoirs, and more than 100 interviews, is devoted to dispelling the ignorance about triangular and U.S.-Taiwan relations. A quick way to make the point is to look at events in Taiwan in 1957. Until then, Americans believed that with an alliance in place, the U.S. 7th Fleet patrolling the Taiwan Strait, and China at bay, that they enjoyed stable, friendly, and cooperative relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan. The American ambassador was in Hong Kong that May, addressing diplomatic colleagues and praising those ties. But just as he uttered the words, a message arrived. A crowd had pillaged his embassy, hurling a massive safe out the window onto his car, which happened to be parked beneath it. Americans had been injured, and classified papers littered the street. The riot and the surprise demonstrated on the part of Americans suggest the depth of mistrust and misunderstanding between Taipei and Washington, even at the very peak of the relationship. In part, this, by the way, is Dwight Eisenhower addressing a crowd in Taipei, last president to have visited the island from the United States. In part, this disorder in 1957 erupted because of the acquittal of an American for killing a Chinese, evoking amongst the Chinese bitter memories of extraterritoriality, under which foreigners lived exempt from local law and magnifying resentment against American racism. Although recognizing that public outrage was genuine, Washington concluded that Chiang Kai-shek had manipulated the anger to convey displeasure with U.S. policies, including prohibitions against raids on the mainland, a lack of support for retaking the mainland, and insistence on withdrawing forces from the offshore islands. Taipei feared that Washington would not protect its interests and would sell Taiwan out to the People's Republic of China, even as the United States worried that it could not count on Taiwan to share its security priorities in the Cold War, instead dragging it into a hot war with China. Taipei would have been all the more anxious had it known that privately Dwight Eisenhower wanted to end the trade embargo against China, bring the People's Republic into the United Nations through dual representation, and establish diplomatic relations. On both sides, differences in priorities and perspectives raised questions about the wisdom and the durability of the alignment. But the island emerged as a strategic outpost in the Cold War, and Chiang Kai-shek, however authoritarian, became a symbol of freedom in contrast to Mao's communist tyranny. Taiwan soon became a base for intelligence and sabotage operations, particularly aerial reconnaissance, signals monitoring, and coastal raids. And here you see the Yangmingshan intelligence post still exists today, from which the United States was able to listen in to communications on the mainland and between the mainland and the Soviet Union and others. In time, Taiwan experienced an economic boom, becoming a significant American trade partner. Nevertheless, the enormous disparities in power, culture, size, development, responsibilities rendered cooperation between the United States and Taiwan difficult. Americans were disturbed by evidence that Taiwan was trying to build nuclear weapons, spying in the United States, and violating human rights, both in the United States and at home. Although the United States saw itself as Taiwan's savior, its liberator from the Japanese, provider of generous aid, and advocate of democratic values, many in Taiwan saw it as a conspirator in and a facilitator of Kuomintang authoritarian rule through martial law repression. And indeed, that was called the White Terror, and there was widespread killing, imprisonment, and other things that went on in this period. And U.S. officials practiced willful ignorance to accommodate Cold War goals, supporting Chiang Kai-shek's government as it eliminated a generation of political leaders. Distrust of and resentment against the U.S., therefore, did not just color the views of the leadership in Taiwan. It also endured amongst a great many ordinary residents of the island whose families and friends had been targeted during the White Terror. When in 1969, Richard Nixon abandoned Cold War assumptions about Red China, which is what we used to call it, and stopped seeing the Republic of China as a bastion of American values to begin normalization with Beijing, he triggered a whole new level of distrust. Among the important issues discussed in Straight Talk is the mythology surrounding the U.S.-China opening, including claims that only Nixon could have gone to China, and the contention of Henry Kissinger that he barely discussed Taiwan in his earliest talks in Beijing in July of 1971. But declassified records show clearly that Taiwan was China's highest priority, and that Kissinger accommodated by surrendering more than the Chinese expected, willing to sell Taiwan out in order to get normalization. Now, don't get me wrong, normalization was the right thing to do and important for U.S. national interests. But I contend that the U.S. gave away more than necessary in order to get it. One might argue the logic of promising to jettison the Mutual Defense Treaty, remove U.S. troops from Taiwan, not give Taipei assistance to attack the mainland, support Chiang Kai-shek, support China getting a seat in the United Nations, and assure China that the CIA would no longer run covert operations from the island. Somewhat less clear is pledging not to support independence or two Chinas, and promising to keep Japan out of Taiwan. Largely indefensible was not demanding that the People's Republic of China renounce the use of force against Taiwan. In truth, Americans did not expect the Republic of China to survive normalization, and the Chinese mistakenly counted on the ROC's collapse, believing Kissinger's assurances. Thus, Nixon and Kissinger, I would contend, visited significant damage upon U.S. integrity, diplomacy, and democracy. And that, I think, is the most serious indictment of the policies they pursued. Similar secrecy enveloped China policy in the Carter administration. And again, there are myths about what happened in this period. Two in particular, have also colored our understanding of U.S.-Taiwan relations and the distrust at its center. First, it has been said that American officials proceeded in great secrecy on this diplomatic recognition of China because Taiwan would otherwise have managed to block recognition. Moreover, secondly, it has been argued that the omnibus bill that once redrafted became the Taiwan Relations Act was written under intense time pressure and therefore unavoidably left things out. But my interviews and the examination of records at the Jimmy Carter Library demonstrated conclusively that drafters of the Taiwan bill had plenty of time to craft provisions. The administration simply did not care about Taiwan, being preoccupied with the China issue and seeing Taiwan as expendable. As for Carter's zealous secrecy, my research shows that Taiwan intelligence actually had a pretty good idea of what was going on, and that if Taiwan had had any way to stop recognition, it would have done so, with or without the exact details on timing and what the U.S. and China were saying to each other. In fact, Taiwan's leaders could not find a formula to end America's romance with China and were slow to plan for an unwelcome future. Taiwan's leaders were tradition-bound, mired in cultural restraints, and either unwilling or unable to set aside partisan and personal ambitions to counter or to work with the United States. Even a purportedly sympathetic American president, like Ronald Reagan, who here is meeting Chiang Kai-shek on a visit he took for Richard Nixon to Taiwan, sowed mistrust once he became president with his declaration that the Chinese were actually not communists. He said that in Beijing on a visit to China. His failure to sell advanced fighter aircraft to Taiwan, and his decision to sign the August 1982 arms sales communique, which was and remains the single most significant step towards ending arms sales to Taiwan that any president before or since has taken. He also did not reestablish diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, even though he had pledged to do so during his presidential campaign. Now, Reagan did provide 6 written assurances about Taiwan's future to Taipei, including that the United States would not set an end date for arms sales, that it would not consult the People's Republic on the nature of those sales, that it wouldn't be a mediator, that it wouldn't pressure Taiwan to negotiate. And further than that, he dictated a secret memo clarifying the conditions of U.S. support to make sure that the small group of people at the top of the U.S. government understood what his policies were. But the reality is that Reagan cared little about Taiwan. For him, it was a pawn in the Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. He never bothered learning about its history, its economy, or its culture, because what was important to Ronald Reagan was using, not saving, Taiwan. Taiwan officials repeatedly thought sympathetic American presidents would rescue the Republic of China, but repeatedly they were wrong. Oops. Thank you. Technology should not be allowed to be in the hands of anyone over 18. So some of you out there maybe also are disqualified. Okay. So Taiwan relied upon a series of American presidents, some of whom were quite sympathetic in theory, but in fact, when it came to doing something for Taiwan, it turned out that Taiwan's hopes were misplaced. Here you have Bill Clinton and his attitude towards Taiwan and China. What became increasingly significant to the U.S.-Taiwan relationship was instead democratization, which began in the mid-1980s. It clearly distinguished Taiwan from China. It created a bond with the United States more fundamental than existed before and more significant, I would say, than a mutual defense treaty. But it did not lessen mistrust. In fact, the United States has sometimes had great difficulty working with Taiwan's unpredictable democracy. Giving the public a voice spurred the development of a Taiwan identity, greater interest on the island in independence, and friction across the Taiwan Strait. The United States could no longer rely on a government there to enforce agreements with the United States over the objections of the public. And the U.S. was repeatedly blindsided by Taiwan electoral politics. Some of you perhaps remember that after 9/11, George W. Bush, believing that the United States needed Chinese cooperation in fighting terrorists and angered by Taiwan's president Chen Shui-bian's refusal to take U.S. priorities into consideration, chided Taiwan for being provocative. That was really adopting Chinese language about Chen. And you may know that Chen Shui-bian, like his predecessor Li Dongwei, relished testing the limits of China's patience and U.S. support, seeking to shift the balance of strategic ambiguity in Taiwan's favor. Dangerous Strait is a book before the one that I'm talking about, in which I argue about the importance of strategic ambiguity to American military and political policies, and I recommend it highly for you to read. The implications for today of this heritage that I've described to you are clear. Several months ago, in speaking about this book to audiences like you, I could say that U.S.-Taiwan relations had significantly improved. Ma Ying-jeou, the current president, there on my left, your right, is a Harvard-trained lawyer, fluent in English, with very sober policies. He has carefully kept Washington informed, and Taiwan and the United States were making significant progress in resolving trade disputes and moving towards a free trade agreement. But a lot has happened since then, demonstrating that mutual mistrust remains very close to the surface. There is the much written about controversy over beef. I don't know how many of you have followed this, but Taiwan has long imported a great deal of beef from the United States. Then objections were raised about the possibility of mad cow disease. I remember when mad cow disease broke out here, I swore that I wasn't going to eat beef either, but if you live in the United States and they sell it and it looks so good, I went ahead. But the Taiwan people didn't think they needed to. And so in the fall, when the U.S. government negotiated an agreement with Taiwan to resume the sales of beef in Taiwan, there were massive public demonstrations against the idea of beef and against the Taiwan government, so much so that in early 2010, the Taiwan legislature actually revoked the agreement, essentially. They passed some new legislation, and the agreement was out the window, which made the United States and Barack Obama very unhappy. Beyond this tiff over beef, Taiwan worries about the American reaction to the cross-strait relationship and the improvements in that relationship. Indeed, Taiwan worries that the United States is not happy with the improvement in cross-straits relations, even though the United States has repeatedly assured the Taiwan people that we think it's a good idea. But scholars and pundits and members of the government in Taiwan believe that the United States fears losing military secrets to China, is worried about freeing Beijing from a major security distraction in the strait, jeopardizing Japanese sea lanes of supply, and that there will be accelerated and unrestrained economic integration between Taiwan and China, possibly shutting American businessmen out. But just to show that you cannot win in this relationship, Taiwan also worries that Washington might be too happy about an improvement in cross-straits relations because it might see that as an excuse to stop selling weapons to Taiwan. Arms sales have, of course, been at the heart of recent distress in U.S.-China relations, alongside issues over Iran, Burma, the Dalai Lama, cybersecurity. You've all heard about Google leaving China. Human rights. This is Liu Xiaobo, who just got 11 years in prison for just talking about freedoms in China. There was Copenhagen, the climate change conference, in which there was a confrontation between the U.S. and China. There's the issue of currency, trade protectionism, and, of course, an old standby, which is North Korea. On top of all of that, there has been widespread American feeling that China has become arrogant, that it sees the United States as vulnerable and President Obama as weak. The Obama administration, of course, announced the sale of a $6.4 billion package of weapons, including Black Hawk helicopters, PAC-3 missiles, harpoons, minesweepers, and communications equipment. Beijing has, of course, protested this sale very loudly and threatened to disrupt military-to-military exchanges with the United States and to put sanctions on those American companies that manufacture the equipment that the U.S. is planning to sell to Taiwan. Now, this might be conceived as, for those of you who know this sort of thing, killing the chicken to scare the monkey. In other words, what China's really worried about is not the $6.4 billion sale, but the determination to prevent sales of F-16CD aircraft to Taiwan. Taiwan is seeking the sale of this aircraft, of course, to enhance its capabilities. In fact, planes in the Taiwan Air Force are falling out of the sky. Many of them are obsolete. And if Taiwan is to have an Air Force at all, and some people would argue it doesn't need one, but if it's going to have one, it's going to have the F-16. But also symbolically, the F-16 emphasizes strong ties between the United States and Taiwan. From the U.S. point of view, however, Taipei ought to take a time out and be grateful for what the United States has already sold, because after all, the U.S. is taking a big hit with China for doing this for Taiwan. And indeed, given the difficulties in U.S.-China relations at the moment, it is very likely to be the case that the U.S. is not going to sell the F-16 at least this year, even though a recent Defense Department study said that Taiwan really needs the plane. Taiwan is also anxious about pressure from Beijing on an untested young president regarding arms sales more generally. After all, Taipei knows a lot about pressure that comes hidden in appealing packages. And here you have panda bears that China gave Taiwan, but before they shipped them across the straits, named them so that if you put their names together, it says unification. So China takes every opportunity to stick it to Taiwan. The U.S. worries about China's missiles that remain in position to hit Taiwan, some 1,500 of them. Beijing's impatience for political talks and a peace accord across the strait. Ma Ying-jeou's diminishing popularity at home. His approval ratings went from the 60s to below 30%, quite precipitously this past fall. And Taiwan's willingness to maintain adequate self-defense capabilities. And so the title of the book, Straight Talk, highlights not just a place, but also the need to deal honestly and constructively to reach long-lasting solutions and to confront the problem of mistrust forthrightly. It is not just U.S.-China relations that must be approached candidly, cooperatively, constructively, comprehensively, to borrow, and positively, to borrow just the language of the last three administrations in their view of U.S.-China relations. Simply because U.S.-Taiwan relations are progressing smoothly at present does not mean that those relations are getting enough attention, being adequately managed, or that contingencies are being fully accounted for, or that multiple future policy options and events are being studied and understood. A generalized lapse into complacency is, of course, understandable, given the dire problems that Washington faces at home and around the world, as well as the promising developments between Taipei and Beijing. But it is a luxury that none of us can afford. The PRC should not be allowed to think that it can do whatever it wants with Taiwan. Taiwan cannot be cut adrift, lacking the support it needs to improve cross-straits relations, or at the least prevent their deterioration. And Americans should not be left ignorant and apathetic, lest a new crisis once again catch them unawares and unprepared. Today, mistrust between the U.S. and Taiwan remains deep, broad, and justified. Mistrust reveals conflicting worldviews and aspirations as well as cultural disparities. And it highlights, I would argue, the lack of personal contact between leaders barred from meeting with each other, not by any United States agreement with China, but because of a unilateral decision made by the United States that high-level American officials will not meet with leaders of Taiwan. As Straight Talk demonstrates, then, I say conclusively, between the United States and Taiwan, there is much work to be done. Mutual trust will not be built easily or quickly, but the effort must begin now.
Okay, we have 20 minutes time for questions and answers.
If we increase our mutual trust with Taiwan, do we run the risk of possibly losing some of our strategic ambiguity? And is there a chance that Taiwan could then be more confident with maybe trying to change the status quo between themselves and China?
That's a very good question, but I would argue that trust is is a different thing in different parts of the relationship. That even strategic ambiguity does not work if Taiwan thinks the United States is cooking up some sort of deal with China. Recently, two high-level members of the administration, the Deputy Undersecretary, the Undersecretary of State, James Steinberg, and the key China person on the National Security Council, Jeff Bader, went to Beijing. And what they were there to talk about was Iran and a variety of other issues. What the Chinese talked about was Taiwan, 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 the whole time that they were there. Moreover, in the fall, when the president went to China, he signed something that they've called a joint statement, in which the Chinese somehow managed to get Americans to say that we respect China's core interests, and including its territorial integrity and sovereignty, and then in the very next paragraph talk about Taiwan. Now, the Americans claim that these are separate paragraphs, that they don't talk about the same thing. Core interest is one thing, and then we went on to talk about Taiwan. But from the Chinese point of view, and from the point of view of people in Taiwan, those go together. And so it looks as though the United States has conceded a lot to China. To come back to what you were asking, I would argue, therefore, that the balance of trust here is so fragile that reassurance to Taiwan is necessary. Will it push Taiwan to a position where it does something unreasonable? Probably not, because Taiwan still does not know whether or not the United States will in fact send forces if there is an outbreak of a military clash in the Strait. We've done it before, but we never say we will do it again. I would argue we certainly will, but they don't know for sure. And so that's one reason. The other reason is they simply don't have the capability. You know, if anybody was going to try to do something like that, it probably would have been Chen Shui-bian while he was president for 8 years. And of course, he made nothing like that kind of attempt. So I don't think that's an issue. But I do think you have to have trust with China as well, that this is very carefully a balancing act. And that's why strategic ambiguity is such a good policy. Yeah.
Now, do you think Taiwan has been a strong motivation for China's very increased development of its mine warfare capabilities?
Whether Taiwan provides the excuse?
Taiwan's basically the Strait of Taiwan stuff, because there's been recent articles on how China has been putting a lot of effort into its mine warfare technologies, and in some articles it's actually stated that China's mine warfare is actually more advanced than ours at the present moment, and they continue to go ahead and do so. You think Taiwan is the major motivator in that, or
Absolutely. Taiwan isn't just a major motivator for mines, but for the entire span of Chinese military modernization. The People's Liberation Army has used the Taiwan scenario to drive weapons acquisition, training, to make decisions about what kind of military that it needs to have. I mean, one of the things that used to be talked about in Washington, that we didn't really have to worry about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan because it would have to be a 10 million man swim. China lacked the amphibious capabilities. It's got all that today. It has built with the assumption that conceivably it might have to go after Taiwan one day. It doesn't want to, but it certainly wants the capability to do it. That's why it's put so much money into cruise missiles and other things that it's put along that coast. Now, one of the interesting questions, I think, is that as relations across that strait improve, the People's Liberation Army is going to need a new potential enemy. It's going to have a new goal to build toward. And some of you in this room might start feeling uneasy, because I would suggest that they will probably assume that we are the new goal to build toward, and that they may need capabilities other than ones that would be strictly applied to Taiwan. So your assumption, I think, is absolutely correct, only it's far bigger and a little more scary, even than just mines. Yeah.
I mean, given the unpredictability of the Taiwan's democracy and Biden diminishing popularity, do you think Taiwan will go back to like maybe Chen Shui-bian's era and maybe jeopardize and cross-strait stability?
Well, I'm not worried about Taiwan going back to a Chen Shui-bian kind of situation, but that doesn't mean that it might not elect a new DPP president. I mean, Ma Ying-jeou's popularity has gone way down, and part of the reason for that was that when people elected him, the assumption was he was he was clean, that he had integrity, that there would be no corruption in his administration, that he would reach out to people, that he would provide the kinds of domestic services and support that the Chen government was somewhat erratic in providing. Truth of the matter is, he hasn't turned out to be as effective a president as I think Taiwan would like, or that Washington would like. There has been corruption in his government. When a huge typhoon hit Taiwan, he was very slow in providing assistance and indeed in asking foreign governments to help. And on the beef crisis, there really didn't need to be a crisis if he had tried to educate the population. We've got another thing like that coming up with the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement that's going to be signed between Taiwan and China. And again, the Ma administration isn't doing a good job in telling people what this is and why Taiwan needs it. So I think there is a possibility that Ma could get defeated in 2012, which is when the next election happens. It is Beijing's worst nightmare. From Beijing's point of view, Ma Ying-jeou may be flawed, but he's the best they're going to get. And so, in part, China's trying to make up its mind right now. How much do we support him? How many concessions do we give Taiwan in order to ensure that Ma will win? The other part of that question is democracy in Taiwan, and what that requires is a strong opposition party. And the Democratic Progressive Party has been in disarray since Chen left the presidency. They need a good, strong candidate in 2012. There are a couple of people that might qualify, but so far nobody that really electrifies the population. Unless they can solve that problem, I think the election is the Kuomintang's to lose. But I'm not worried about the continuing functioning of democracy. I think we've seen 2 changes of government, and I think democracy is pretty clearly well established on their own.
Rucker. How does Japan figure into all of this, given some speculation that they're going to go fully nuclear within another 15 years or so? That's been our focus for our defense in terms of the Cold War, and it still is today. What's the relationship that you see there in terms of this overall picture?
Well, I've thought for a long time that the United States misunderstands Japan's policies on Taiwan. That we worry a lot about, will the Japanese let us use Okinawa if there's a military clash? Or will they say no? Is this going to hurt the U.S.-Japan alliance, etc.? What that leaves out is Japan's independent ties to Taiwan. After all, Taiwan was a Japanese colony from 1895 to 1945. The former president that I mentioned, Lee Teng-hui, speaks better Japanese than he speaks Chinese because he grew up in the Japanese educational system. So there are very tight relations here. And I would argue, and there are still a lot of economic ties as well, I would argue that if China were to put aside its peaceful policy and go after Taiwan, I think Japan would absolutely be there with us. That not only would they let us use facilities, but they would also provide logistic and other kinds of support because they don't want to see Taiwan in Chinese hands. In fact, I would go further and say even if it's a peaceful unification, Japan will be worried because Japanese sea lanes go right past Taiwan. Now, people will argue that, well, you just make the ships sail further out to sea. And that's certainly possible. But everybody that I talk to in your part of the world, a little higher in rank, have explained to me that you can do that, but it's more expensive. It's more unpredictable because of weather conditions and other things, so that giving up those routes by Taiwan would be a real blow to Japan's economy and security. And so I think Japan has a lot of its own reasons for being concerned about this problem and for aligning itself with the United States. Some of you may remember, although now it's quite a long time ago, that the United States and Japan sort of revivified the security alliance. It's probably 10 years ago now. And the United States wasn't sure how far Japan would go, but Japan quite explicitly in that agreement said it was concerned about developments in the areas surrounding Japan. And that clearly was meant to include Taiwan.
Next.
Yeah.
What do you see as the long-term future relationship between Taipei and Beijing?
Good question. I think at present, everybody is assuming that the status quo is going to last a long time. And I think that is the assumption in Beijing as much as it is in Taipei and in Washington. China is counting on a long-term strategy of economic integration and cultural integration as well. They're trying to persuade the people of Taiwan that being part of a greater China is glorious and prestigious and other things. As a historian, I go back to 1964, and that was, the heart of the Cold War. But when China exploded its first nuclear device, overseas Chinese, who otherwise hated the communists, celebrated all around the world because China was great. China had stood up. Look at this scientific achievement that the Chinese people had made. So China's trying to package things that way, and it hopes over time that people in Taiwan will think, here we are on this stinky little island. There are only 23 million of us. Even if you become president of Taiwan, what's the big deal? There's 1.3 billion over there. Look at the business we can do. Look at the prestige we can have. So that's China's game plan, long term. So today, I don't think they're pushing unification. They're simply trying to stop independence. Will Taiwan eventually become part of China? I think that may well be the case because Taiwan's position is getting weaker and weaker. The key variable may be that if China, and this is just sort of my vision of what should happen, if China were actually to become a democracy in which the government was legitimate because the people had voted for it, I think that then maybe nationalism would be a little less important, and Taiwan going its own way would not, to the same extent, undermine the control of the authorities in Beijing of the country. But an opposite argument can be made, and that is that there are a lot of younger people, your age, not your age, their age, in Taiwan, that, in China, that have been educated in a system that says Taiwan is tremendously important, nationalism is key, and we cannot let Taiwan go. So I think it's somewhat unclear, but I think unless China moves significantly in a direction of democracy, it's not going to give up on getting Taiwan back. And over time, I think Taiwan's ability to resist that is going to diminish a lot.
And do you think that the democratization of the PRC, if it were to happen in the future, would maybe influence people in Taiwan to want to integrate with China anyway?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I mean, that in some ways that's the ideal, isn't it? That China begins to look so good that people in Taiwan will want to be part of it. And if you go back really to the Cold War period and Chiang Kai-shek and his son Jiang Junhua, they always talked about how the Republic of China would be a model for the mainland and that the mainland could learn from them. I think there's still a lot of hope. The negative side of that, I was saying this to somebody yesterday in the intelligence community because I spoke at a conference there yesterday, that the problem is that that's what we all thought about Hong Kong before 1997 and its return to China, that Hong Kong had freer institutions, a free press, all these other things, and it would have a really positive influence on the rest of China. I think that's a very hard argument to make today when, if anything, repression in China is growing. Crackdowns on the press are more frequent. So could Taiwan have that same positive effect? It would depend how long this takes and how much democracy it develops. But that, I think, is the vision that we all ought to have and hope for.
The historical situation, the relationship between Japan and Taiwan clearly influences the relationship today. I'm curious about another American ally in the region, South Korea, which also dances around China, negotiates with China. Problems in the strait, what would South Korea do?
South Korea has really stayed away from that issue quite substantially. Now, the one key factor would be if there were still U.S. troops on the ground in South Korea, would the government there try to prevent those troops from being used in a Taiwan contingency? I'm not sure we're terribly clear on that. But the whole military presence in Korea is in such flux that I don't think that's a question that's very high in the list of priorities of all the things that Korea doesn't want us to do, right? So, but I would say Korea lacks the kinds of ties. And in fact, it's even more than that. While Taiwan was having a relatively, and that's very relative, a relatively good experience being a colony of Japan, South Korea was having a terrible experience being a colony of Japan. They got all the nasty stuff while Taiwan got a lot of the good stuff. And so there's no great love lost there anyway. But they do have an economic relationship and other things that Korea would be sorry to lose. So I'm not absolutely sure.
Okay, we have time for last question, and that's from me. You know, we often play a war game here in the Newport, and it's a game. A game involves gambling, to a certain extent, and which is related to this ambiguity, strategic ambiguity. And if you make it deliberately ambiguous, and then you have 50-50 chance of doing things. 50-50 chance, so maybe people won't take chances. That's a gambling mentality.
Right.
So some people might argue, if you have a deliberate ambiguity, and yet you are very vital to the outcome of any conflict. Well, people might argue historically, for example, during the Korean War, the North Koreans took the gamble that U.S. might or might not come in, because the United States say we are not going in, but all sides say we might go in. So, and then the same thing happened with Saddam Hussein. I mean, when he said, I'm going to go to Kuwait, the U.S. was, oh, we may or may not, we're not clear on that. So that's strategic ambiguity to me. So my question is, some might argue strategic ambiguity might just prove to be the exact opposite in terms of consequence. That is, you might encourage people to take gamble. And one way to do that, of course, they deliberately want to test your bottom line to see where exactly what you really mean. So by doing that, they make cantankerous, provocative measures and speeches, and that become a pattern and not intensify the relationship. I mean, what do you think of that?
Okay. Well, I actually have spent a lot of time talking about that because in the last part of the second Clinton administration, there was a lot of discussion of what they were then calling strategic clarity. They argued that this ambiguity might mislead people. And if they weren't sure what the U.S. would do, they might indeed try to test us, and that we should be clearer about our policies. The problem that I see with that is that if you start providing a laundry list, we will intervene if this happens, or if that happens, or if that happens. What if they do something else that we don't have on our list? You know, as you said, they might probe, they might try. You never said you were going to do X, and so we're going to go ahead and try it. So I think that's a danger of trying to be so clear that everybody's absolutely sure of what we're going to do. A second problem is that we're a democracy. We don't know what we're going to do. I mean, you guys are disciplined and people tell you what you're going to do and more or less you do it. But the U.S. Congress, let me tell you, is not like you at all. And they're going to be very much influenced by what's going on in the country at the time, who's president, you know, what they had for breakfast. And so it's hard to predict what the United States will do because it is a democracy. So I think that, and I see people getting restless, you have to go. So I think that ambiguity remains the right choice, but I guess a vigilant ambiguity, one where we're not asleep at the stick.
Ambiguity with a clarity is good. With that, that's a very, very informative as well as educational lecture, and I think it's a very comprehensive picture of Taiwan's relationship. I'm sure we would ask you more questions if we have more such opportunities. And thank you very much for this. I understand that you have your class to go, and thank you.